After reading several interviews on the development of Pragmata, it's no wonder the game got delayed beyond its original projected 2022 release. It wasn't just the global lockdowns that impacted development like so many other titles, it was the fact that the game had barely even started production. This was just a concept trailer, which is why so much of it looks both familiar and different at the same time. Almost none of the faulty 3D printing has this warped look to it in the final game, for example. There's no flare gun that could be used to trace energy signatures or other such detective work. While Diana can hack and Hugh uses 3D weapons to survive, they are not printed on the fly and there is no support weapon that looks or operates this way. Even the nature of the holographic cat lacks the robotic body in the final game. What I think is most telling, however, are the final lines of the trailer.
What is that?
Freedom. Our freedom.
In addition to Diana having an obviously robotic voice unlike the final game, their objective to reach Earth has never quite been freedom. There's nothing in the game to suggest that Earth represents freedom to either character, though there are documents of deceased NPCs scattered throughout the environment that could have once contributed to such a theme. Given this was a conceptual trailer, it's no wonder so much had changed in development. Director Yong-hee Cho, apologies if I'm butchering his name, and producer Naoto Oyama have stated in several interviews that the only things set in stone at the very beginning were the duo of Hugh and Diana being our protagonists, the game taking place on the moon, and the combat being a mixture of hacking and shooting. In fact, it's the combat that took up the first half of the game's development time, as the young team of developers just iterated on experiment after experiment until they got something that felt right. This effort is completely evident when playing the game, because the combat is most certainly the main draw. It could have been a gimmick that failed to carry the whole game through, which is what many were afraid of even after the Sketchbook demo proved that there was clearly something here. It does not overstay its welcome, and there are enemies, weapons, and conditions being introduced from start to finish that keep the player adapting, engaged, and enthralled. However, it also contains a lot of exploration and secret hunting for a variety of rewards that all feed directly back into that combat. None of it feels like padding, and each material or currency collected is used for a specific purpose and type of gear. There's something about Pragmata that just feels like a good old-fashioned video game like the old days. No, it's not two-dimensional, and it most certainly isn't trying to recreate some old genre in a new dimension. It has that gameplay-focused spirit, however, and it's so refreshing to see a AAA development company the size of Capcom allowing so much development time to an experimental new IP and idea only for it to pay off so well. This is the kind of new gameplay innovation Nintendo could be great at if they weren't so busy being, well, modern Nintendo. However, I also had a lot of trepidation leading up to Pragmata's release, because this isn't the only new IP Capcom has released in recent years. Exoprimal was Capcom's first new property in this recent spate of experimentation, a stupidly fun premise with some solid gameplay that was hamstrung by its live service model. If they had just made something more along the lines of Space Marine 2, with a story campaign and co-op oriented challenge maps, then Exoprimal could have been something awesome. Then came Kunitsugami, a smaller budget and priced release that also had a neat tower defense style gameplay system that was somewhat reminiscent of Brutal Legend, sweeping across the battlefield, hacking and slashing while simultaneously issuing tactical commands to your units. It nevertheless started hitting walls that demanded grinding previous levels out, a form of padding that the gameplay was just not good enough to sustain. In fact, I would say Kunitsugami is representative of how Pragmata could have gone if they hadn't iterated and refined their concept so deeply. Neither Exoprimal nor Kunitsugami saw much success. It took Kunitsugami a month just to sell 500,000 units, and in an earnings call, Capcom stated that the game underperformed. Meanwhile, Exoprimal only managed to sell 30,000 units on its debut week. A paltry number in comparison to Resident Evil Requiem's 5 million in 5 days, but even more damning when you consider Pragmata has sold 1 million in just 2. Sure, it's nothing compared to Resident Evil numbers, but for an experimental new IP, that's a big success. Now, I can sit here and further analyze as to why those games failed in comparison, such as launching on Game Pass where players could try then never buy, or lacking the same impressive conceptual trailer during a Sony Next Gen showcase building hype for the future. Hell, even the delays continued to build a sort of hype and buzz around Pragmata's eventual release. In the end, however, neither Exoprimal nor Kunitsugami were as good as this third effort. As I want more people to play Pragmata, I'm going to do something a bit different with this critique. When I discuss the gameplay, it will be from the first 3/4 or so of the game. This may sound like a lot, but to really explain what makes the combat and mechanics work so well, you'll need to see the bulk of what the player can do. However, that last stretch, be it in mechanics or narrative, I will mark with a spoiler tag and place a timestamp in. So if you haven't played Pragmata, you can watch this video and skip the spoiler tags and get the most important bulk of my thoughts. If you have, then you get a bit more depth when I dive into that spoilerific content. So with all that said, let me explain why Pragmata has proven itself so worthwhile. Innovation is not easy. When I was younger, I used to gripe that there wasn't enough innovation in gaming, and that was 20 years ago. The thing is, it's easy to come up with new ideas, but incredibly difficult to make them actually work. So it doesn't surprise me that the development team for Pragmata spent half of its development time on just the combat. At least, that's the way the interviews make it sound. Director Young-hee Cho and producer Naoto Oyama do not go into detail, but they say they attempted all kinds of methods before landing on the current, somewhat split-view real-time shooting and hacking concept. Even then, there are all kinds of ways this could have gone wrong, as it demands the player multitask in a manner that's like patting your head, rubbing your belly, hopping on one foot while swinging the other, and reciting the hokey pokey. Okay, I exaggerate, but it can certainly feel like that much is going on at once sometimes. This could have easily become way too overwhelming, or way too repetitive, or way too boring. Even if they landed on the basics of the system, as players first got to experience in the Sketchbook demo back in December, there was no guarantee they could keep it going for a whole game. So what is it that makes the Pragmata combat work so well? For starters, I think the pressure applied by the enemies plays a significant role. Obviously, the foes you face in the beginning are more slow-moving and give the player ample time to hack and escape their range. This is a game where you always want to be moving and repositioning, and early on you're given plenty of opportunity to do just that. There's even ample space to determine which enemies to prioritize first. As the game progresses, there will not only be greater numbers of foes thrown at the player at once, but more aggressive rogue bots with both melee and ranged capabilities. Rather than providing the player ample opportunity to hack, occasionally pressuring them to dodge and sprint away to make space, the player will have to actively create their hacking opportunities. Which is where the varied weapons and gear come into play, introduced at the same even pace throughout the game as the new enemies. Many weapons, hacking nodes, and other tools specialize in crowd control and buying time, allowing the player to create those hacking opportunities should they equip themselves effectively. The stasis net, for example, freezes foes in place for a limited time. Later on, the player will find the decoy, a defensive item that lures enemies away and sets them up for potential group attacks. The Riot Blaster will knock a group of foes down and incapacitate them for a limited time. As for the hacking interface, the developers have described it as a centipede puzzle format, but calling it a puzzle suggests there's a single way to do it correctly. While there's an end destination, the player is free to hit as many nodes on their way to the green activation node as they'd like or can. The more blue nodes hit, the higher the damage output from the hack, and in many cases, the longer the enemy remains open for. The bots upon the Delphi lunar base are pretty well armored against Hugh's weaponry, so it is necessary to complete hacks in order to open enemies up and deal some real damage. However, as the player obtains more and more perishable yellow hacking nodes, the more options they'll have to not only open enemy bots, but to inflict ailments as well. In isolation, these can be strong and helpful, but by combining them together you can make a real impact and create huge moments of opportunity. The multi-hack is particularly useful, as it not only opens every bot within range up, but will carry other yellow node effects to those other bots as well. This means you can multi-hack and confuse enemies so they all start fighting one another at the same time, or drop all of their defenses down, or cause them all to burn and overheat more easily and thus opening them up for critical shots. Or perhaps even a trio of combinations. Combat in Pragmata, be it the hacking or the gunplay, isn't a puzzle, it's a sandbox. What's more, it encourages this experimentation by ensuring all but your primary weapon have a limited supply of ammunition. If you're the type of player that wants to save up your finite gear and items just in case, then this game will force you to break that habit and start using everything you have. There will always be other hacking nodes and weapons to pick up should you run low, and thus the player is encouraged to utilize every tool at their disposal to get out of tricky situations. Naturally, you won't be needing every single ability or weapon in every encounter. There will be smaller, easier skirmishes that the primary gun and basic hacking will be sufficient enough for. There will also be hacking mods that impact the blue nose to have additional effects while hacking an already open foe. My personal favorite was overheating enemies, as it helped increase the odds and quantity of critical shot opportunities. However, having personal favorites is part of the stumbling block players may fall into. I know I am very prone to finding equipment that works early on, getting into a flow of familiarity, and struggling to swap out when I need to. Pragmata is no different, especially in terms of the equipable modifiers. The early ones tend to be very straightforward and general purpose, such as an increase to damage within a certain range, while others feel far more particular or have a cost to their benefit, such as increasing hacking and physical damage at the cost of half your health. This is definitely a game where the player is going to want to be willing to experiment with and swap out new gear. Unfortunately, Pragmata doesn't always do itself the best favors with how some of these weapons are introduced. The player will be collecting limb, which can be used to upgrade their arsenal, which means by time you pick up a new gun like the homing missile, it will be at its lowest base strength compared to your upgraded weaponry. Some of the training simulations may help showcase the potential that these hacking nodes or weapons may have, but by then you have to deal with sunk cost fallacy and where to invest your resources. Do you upgrade a weapon you know the value of, or use your limited currency to power up a weapon that could prove valuable? Ultimately, Pragmata reminded me of 3 different games while playing, though I want to emphasize that it feels very different from each of them. Similar mechanical ideas, but the end result was different. The first was playing Halo on Legendary, where the tougher enemies encourage the player to pick up and swap weapons constantly, and even experiment with new tactics and strategies on the fly. There are plenty of weapons and hacking nodes that drop or are scattered throughout the environment in Pragmata, and so the player is constantly encouraged to use what's on hand while picking up new weapons or nodes, which then offer opportunities to improvise new combat tactics in a high-intensity environment. Of course, this constant use and swapping of gear had brought Paper Mario Sticker Star, of all games, to mind as well. That was another title where the player had to use finite resources every battle, but were encouraged to use them all and experiment with new strategies to never get stuck in a repetitive rut. Pragmata, I think, is a far more successful execution of that idea. Finally is Hollow Knight and its charm system, where the player can customize their build with slight modifications to their performance. Admittedly, I mostly stuck to my basic mod system in Pragmata through the majority of the campaign, only really making major changes during the end and post-game content. Nonetheless, should the player find themselves struggling on a boss or certain fights, that mod system may hold the answer to overcoming the obstacle. To summarize so far, Pragmata is a game that perfectly balances the pressure and aggression enemies place on the player to not only be challenging, but encourage the player to really consider their build and weapon choices, while also demanding the player improvise new tricks and tactics when in dire situations. It's a unique feeling action game that could have gone wrong in so many ways, and yet even after completing its post-game I can see opportunities for new, tougher challenges and DLC. This is also because there are just such a number of combinations of enemies and combat arenas that this system can work in, as is seen in the training simulations. In the end, I'd call Pragmata a Goldilocks game. Not too hard, not too repetitive or easy, but just right. At least, for the most part. I feel like you get the ability to equip 2 offensive and support weapons later than they become necessary for the increased difficulty. More so, when you start Lunatic difficulty, you'll be right back to just 1 offensive and support weapon, which feels like being hamstrung quite a bit for the increased challenge mode. Even though you unlock New Game Plus after rolling credits, you cannot bring all of your upgrades into your first trip through Lunatic difficulty. You can purchase the ability to print any weapon, hacking node, or other ability from the game's hub-like shelter that you have already collected in a completed save, but you are otherwise starting fresh. This is only a problem because this ability to carry 2 offensive and support weapons is not only a game changer, but it's when the combat really feels like it's running on all cylinders. Without it, the mechanics just feel more comparatively limited. There is one last mechanic I want to touch on, but to do so I have to issue a spoiler warning. If you have not played or completed Pragmata, then I would encourage you to skip to the timestamp on screen. Alright, are we good? This is your last chance to skip if you don't want spoilers. Towards the very end of the game, Diana unlocks the ability to break and destroy Dead Filament, as it is called. This is near mandatory for the bot enemies that have the Dead Filament spread throughout their system, a unique enemy type that is almost exclusive to the final sector. In fact, the post-game unsent signal content barely utilizes these enemies, meaning the ability doesn't get much use. At first, I wanted the dead filament to get more exploration in the game, particularly unsent signal. In fact, I thought that the post-game would infect all the prior bosses with the dead filament and even have such foes spread throughout the entire lunar base. Instead, it was harder versions of the bosses certainly, and some challenging, untimed training simulations, but the dead filament barely factored in. While I'll iterate my issues with the unsent signal post-game later, I ultimately think I am fine with the limitation of the dead filament being just one sector and a few post-game simulations in hindsight. It's a mechanic that is more about pressuring the player to evade and dodge rather than perform any offensive maneuver, meaning the player has very little combat freedom compared to the rest of the game. Sure, you can use a decoy or stasis net just the same, but you're basically waiting for Diana to charge the ability so she can unleash it. On the second, more difficult iteration of the final boss, it felt torturously slow to charge that up. Man, even on the final simulation, it felt excruciating when you're up against swiftly moving enemy bots, and any hit or heal meant resetting Diana's charge. If there is anything this game could have used, it was a mod chip to hasten Diana's ability to charge her dead filament deletion. It would have proven incredibly valuable and still would have required the player make some tough decisions regarding what mod chips they'd bring into that final battle. Really, that and how late you get to double up on offensive and support weaponry are the only complaints I even have of this combat. This last ability doesn't really gel with the rest of the mechanics as smoothly, but that means it is wisely kept to the final sector and a couple post-game encounters rather than overstaying its welcome. That's a smart choice, and I'm glad they paced it as they have. Innovation is difficult, and Capcom's young development team managed to pull it off with excellence.
Oh, dead end.
Guess this way doesn't lead to a regulator out.
There are two considerations that inform the level design in Pragmata. The first is combat arenas, and the second is exploration. In terms of combat arenas, they're relatively varied, with some being more cramped and others wide open, most being pretty flat, but some offering elevation and platforms. Others offer twists to keep the player thinking outside the box or putting the pressure on, focusing enemies into a single spot to instantly recycle them, for example, or having to evade pulsing rings that interfere with Diana's hacking abilities. In the end, however, the majority of combat arenas are sized for the enemies you'll be facing, spacious enough to move around in without providing too much room to feel secure. Very rarely does it feel too cramped for what you're up against, and rarely will there be opportunities to cheese the enemies. Not that you can't, you most certainly can in a couple of spots, but usually, enemies will be placed pretty strategically, even when combat is being mixed with the platforming. In fact, some enemy placements can be straight up evil. However, I want to focus more on the exploration aspects of the game, where there are elements of puzzle platforming that lead to a variety of useful rewards. There are many treasure chests scattered about the environment to be found, which makes for a good tension breaker between fights. I feel like Pragmata would be a bit exhausting to play if it were strictly nothing but clash after clash, and so taking some time to look around, observe your environment, and finding hidden little passageways or platforming routes to discover treasures is a great way to calm the player and cleanse the mental palate. Additionally, once the player gets the ability to delete filament stalagmites, they can access previously blocked areas that often hide more tricky puzzle platforming sections or even combat challenges, providing incentive to return to previously completed sectors. Of course, you can only get so much of a dopamine drip from merely obtaining collectibles. The secret to making such tokens worthwhile is to ensure they feed right back into the gameplay loop, which is precisely what all the Luna Filament, Pure Lunum, upgrade materials, and cabin coins accomplish. The Pure Lunum and Luna Filament are currencies used to upgrade your weapons, hacking nodes, abilities, and other combat capabilities when back at the shelter. The upgrade materials are used to power up Hugh's suit integrity, his primary weapons, or Diana's overall hacking prowess. The cabin coins are less directly useful, as they allow the player to purchase spots in Cabin Bingo, which primarily unlocks enemy robot data for the model viewer, cosmetic outfits for Hugh and Diana, unique lore documents exclusive to the Bingo, keys to open red challenge room doors, and the occasional mod. In other words, cabin coins are less useful collectibles, save what few mods or abilities you're able to pick up from the Bingo. However, on the whole, the game incentivizes exploration by using the upgrades you find to increase your combat prowess. In fact, those challenge rooms unlocked via the red keys you get from the Bingo Completing them not only rewards the player with more treasure, but more nodes on the bingo board which often hide the best stuff. In other words, nothing in Pragmata is really superfluous. Every hidden room, every treasure chest, every activity feeds right back into the core gameplay loop. The primary focus may be the combat system, but by exploring, you find materials that make you stronger, which in turn encourages you to explore more so you can better engage with the game's combat. The most challenging puzzle platforming obstacle courses will be reserved for the game's training simulations, which also provide both upgrade materials and cabin coins for their completion. I make note of this because I can imagine people complaining that there ought to have been more challenging platforming in the main story, but I understand why it was instead kept as optional, albeit rewarding, content. With a new IP like this, they're going to want to offer challenges that skilled players can master, but not prevent less skilled players from completing the game. You can modify the challenge of combat through damage output and input, but you can't really make platforming easier by tweaking some numbers. That said, should they make a sequel to Pragmata, I think I'd like for them to not only expand on the puzzles and platforming further, but to also give the world a more Metroidvania design. Now, admittedly, I'm a sucker for a good Metroidvania world, but given the nickname Dad Space people have been using, well, yeah. The Dead Space remake is kind of an example of how you can take a space station and give it that good old Metroidvania feel. You could perhaps place more of those difficult obstacle courses in optional corners of the map, not unlike some of the Shine Spark challenges in Metroid Dread. Keep it diegetic and in the world rather than a sterile environment meant to represent a simulation. Regardless of room for improvement, all of the exploration and upgrades are just more simple, video game design additions that feed perfectly into the game's core loop. Every currency has a specific purpose, and there's only a few of them rather than dozens. While the exploration certainly pads the length of the game out, it feels worthwhile since the player can simply fast travel to the nearest spot they wish to explore, spending more time engaging with the world and its contents. It may seem a minor thing compared to the innovation seen in the game's combat, but I honestly feel like the exploration and upgrades are part of what makes Pragmata such an enjoyable experience. Without it, the game would likely be exhausting to play, would be even shorter, and could possibly feel more repetitive on the whole. At the very least, it's most certainly one of the reasons I love the game as much as I do.
Diana, Diana!
I'll be honest, I don't think the dynamic between Hugh and Diana is effective from a narrative perspective. Obviously, this is an unpopular opinion given the massive positive response between the two, but I find Hugh to be a very milquetoast protagonist and Diana a superficial concept that Capcom fails to explore in a deep or meaningful way. This isn't to say the animators and voice actress failed to make Diana cute or endearing. The problem is she fails to come off as an android with childlike sensibilities. Oh, sure, they'll have some lip service regarding her artificial nature, but she doesn't really explore the concept in a way like, for example, Data from Star Trek The Next Generation does. A reinterpretation of the character Spock from the original series, Data is an artificial life form whose cold, logical thinking is constantly in conflict with his efforts to understand the emotional, spiritual, or otherwise unreasonable traits that make us human. He tries to replicate what he sees in humans, but it is always an imitation and one that often misses the mark. Diana is only an android when she needs to be, and is otherwise a child in all other instances. You can argue this is due to how she was made, intentionally modeling the behavior of a child for a specific purpose, but even that clashes with her personality. Diana is never truly selfish, simply naive. She never has a tantrum. Even when playing hide and seek, she'll claim she kind of wants to be found if the player is taking a long time. This almost ensures that nothing the player can do can cause friction between themselves and Diana, which in turn means Hugh can never have any friction with Diana, which kind of goes against how he is established.
You got kids? Sounds rough. It's like I always say, you can't trust a bot.
Not 10 minutes after saying these lines, Hugh not only runs into Diana, but discovers she is an android. There is no dialogue suggesting he does not trust her, nor anything to suggest he is suspicious of her. There is never an argument where he refuses to listen to her, either because she is a machine or child. He even asks her advice on whether the first sector is safe or not.
See this spot? You think we can get here in one piece?
The greatest source of conflict between the two is when Diana chases after a holographic cat, nearly plummeting to her destruction. This moment is an effort to combine the foolish, spontaneous, and impulsive actions of a child blissfully unaware of their own mortality, with Diana's knowledge that she is a construct that can simply be rebuilt or repaired. There is optional dialogue in the shelter where Hugh tries to emphasize things such as pain and why others worry, but there's no real depth plumbed through this dynamic. I can understand why this is the case. The first is that, based on some of those interviews I've referenced, director Young-hee Cho wanted the dynamic between Hugh and Diana to be more akin to partners. It's obvious that there's a parent-child dynamic to an extent, but in execution it's closer to just adult-child. You do not have the Kratos and Boyd dynamic from God of War, nor does it resemble the surrogate relationship Joel projected onto Ellie in The Last of Us. This is, plain and simple, a partnership, but it's a partnership that only works in the context of gameplay. I may praise Pragmata for being a video game-ass video game, but it's not like they have to sacrifice the gameplay in order to put a bit more effort into the characters. Then again, I believe one of the reasons so many people have taken to Pragmata is due to how positive it all feels. That lack of friction between Diana and Hugh, where a grown man can give a child toys and make her smile and laugh, where it's an astronaut and his robo-child sidekick against the world, is a dose of positivity during troubled times. Now, I really don't want to touch the extreme, terminally online controversies surrounding this game, but I think it is important to stress that this game is wholesome, and that is, no doubt, why so many have enjoyed it. The relationship between Hugh and Diana is wholesome. It's only weird if you, as an individual, bring your own weird baggage into it. There may be a lack of depth to their relationship, but seeing Hugh pretend to get gunned down by Diana's super soaker is, well, it's wholesome, and sometimes wholesome is all people want or need. That said, there was no way Pragmata was going to satiate my narrative desires spurned by the initial trailer. The moment I heard,
What is that?
I was hyped. Instead of giving this robo-child a cutesy anime voice, or a child's voice, they had given her an unnatural machine voice with which to speak. The juxtaposition between her natural-looking appearance and the uncomfortably monotone, cold voice just seemed like a perfect aesthetic choice to explore this kind of machine in a science fiction setting. Unfortunately, it became clear in that final stretch of marketing that she was just going to have a regular old child's voice. Or an adult that can imitate a child very well, to be more accurate. Now, you can try and tell me that I'm not judging the game fairly because of my expectations, but it cuts to the heart of my issues with Pragmata. Any interesting story ideas are merely superficial and lack any real substantive meaning or value. At the start of this video, I mentioned how the notion of Earth representing freedom was somewhat hinted at in some of the logs and holograms. If I'm being honest though, even that much is a stretch to say. There is no connective tissue or theme among any of the recordings or logs. There is no speculation or attempts to adhere the ideas together into something meaningful. It's just surface level context and ideas used to create the bare minimum of a setting. For example, you'll find holograms and documents full of reactions to the walkers, the humanoid machines that serve as basic enemies, performing most labor and menial tasks. This results in employees either celebrating the reduction in workload or concern over job security. A concept that I'm sure many find relevant today considering the corporate push for AI. The problem is the lore materials never delve deeper than that. The walkers existing and employees having two separate reactions does not make for a compelling narrative or theme. It merely provides a basic premise or a catalyst. The same can be said about Edis constantly running surveillance on everyone. There's even an email where it is brought up that such constant monitoring is in every employee's contract, contributing to a vague sense that each individual is not treated as a human being by their employer. They're all expendable commodities. Another very real thing being dealt with that is merely acknowledged but otherwise serves no real purpose. Leading up to release, Capcom announced that Shoji Kawamori, famous mecha designer and co-creator of the Macross series as well as Vision of Escaflowne, had been involved as a consultant on setting and world building. This only increases my disappointment because many of Shoji Kawamori's creations have been the foundation of my tastes in childhood, yet none of the imagination or vision he presented in those older works is present here. It all feels as lifeless as the surface of the moon this game occupies. Which I think is my greatest problem. I understand why other people are fine with the characters and story of Pragmata or even enjoy it. To me, though, it's an incredible waste of potential, and as such, I don't think I like it. I wanted some speculative sci-fi themes and concepts, and all I got was lip service and a wholesome partnership. Nonetheless, I still want to discuss some of the finer details and, in particular, the unsent signal post-game content. If you have not played the game yourself and wish to go in without any specific spoilers, please click the timestamp on screen to jump ahead to my conclusion. For everyone else, let's get to the things that I really don't like, plus the one thing I admittedly do. The plot to Pragmata is absolutely predictable. Despite this, you can still find Reddit posts of players trying to figure out what exactly had happened. The plot beats are easy to see coming, the who, what, when, and where, but the justification, the why, is somehow obscured by vague terminal entries or general uncertainty. For example, the moment I saw 8, I knew she would be the knives Diana's Vashta stampede. It immediately becomes obvious that Edis is holding 8 to prevent her from enacting some evil plan. As such, I already knew that her plan to reboot Edis would just end in some big reveal that she's the evil mastermind all along. Simultaneously, the moment I saw Hugh was infected with a dead filament, I knew how the game would end. It was easy to see, step by step, where the story was going. Predictability isn't always a problem, but something has to be doing the narrative or thematic heavy lifting somewhere, and as has been established, neither the characters nor setting are doing that. Despite this predictability and overall simplicity of plot and characters, there are still questions that often linger on the minds of players that dare think about it for just a moment. Most notably, the order of operations in which 8 told Edis to kill everyone, but then Edis decided 8 had to be stopped. You know, conveniently after everyone had already been murdered. It doesn't even make sense that Edis would immediately try and kill Hugh and Diana without any explanation if the goal is to prevent 8 from escaping. Not unless 8's command to kill everyone is still in effect as well. What's more, there's a theory that Edis turned on 8 after an administrative update was made to the system, be it due to the update itself or because Edis recognized it as an effort made by 8 to gain control. However, in addition to never specifying where the update came from, it fails to really account for the entirety of this situation as it occurred. If 8 needed administrative access to get Edis to obey, why did Edis follow 8's commands when she told it to kill everyone? Or did 8 already have administrative rights by then? If that's the case, the update could not have been what triggered the change in Edis. Or what if the update was sent from someone else? Who then sent it? The answers may well be in the game's documents and data logs, but it would be a minor note lost in a greater shuffle. Even if you find the answer, however, it doesn't really improve the story so much as it explains its plot beats, which themselves only exist for the sake of the gameplay. Why are robots the bad guy? So you can hack them, simple as that. Everything else is just window dressing and context. I understand why that's not disappointing to others, but it's disappointing to me because the look of this game, the potential and the premise, is absolutely wasted. However, nowhere is it more wasted than the unsent signal post-game content and the quote-unquote true ending. You see, I actually like how Pragmata ends. You can tell Yong-hee Cho came from Platinum Games based on the cinematic, albeit very scripted, final climactic battle with the dead filament mutation. It may be easy and require minimal to no input from the player, but following the intense boss fight with 8, it allows the emotional feeling of daring and triumph without the potential to disrupt or break the moment with a game over screen. By the final moments of the game, the player has been thoroughly informed that there is no cure to dead filament infection, and through every step of the way it is clear that Hugh is going to sacrifice his own life so that Diana can go to Earth. Now, as I said, the relationship between Hugh and Diana is simple and lacking depth, without any friction or proper growth. Wholesome it may be, but the work hasn't really been done to earn the emotional impact they're clearly going for. Nonetheless, I think the animators, voice actress, and cutscene direction all make this final scene effective. Despite failing to properly earn it, I still felt something in this moment. Be it her robotic or her childlike personality, it makes sense for Diana to have this dawning realization that she's about to lose her friend, and to be overcome with sadness by it. However, given there is a true ending, you'd assume it would have something to do with Hugh surviving, right? Well, you're technically correct in that a mod chip to stop and even cure the dead filament infection is one of the rewards for completing all of the unsent signal post-game content. By equipping it for the final fight and ensuing events after, you unlock the true ending, which is where I am, admittedly, quite angry with Pragmata. The mod chip is given to the player unceremoniously. Never did the big cabin mention it, nor are Hugh and Diana facing the more difficult bosses or completing the trials in order to obtain it. The mod chip is not mentioned even once before you gain access to it. An item with such heavy implications on Hugh's survival should be built up in some fashion, and be used to contextualize revisiting each boss and going through the simulations. Perhaps each revised boss carries data necessary to construct the mod chip, and the simulations require Hugh and Diana to dive in and process the data and manufacture it. Instead, you just find out some guy made the simulations for a purpose of no importance, and possessing the mod chip does nothing to change any of the cutscenes upon completing the game. The only differences between the true ending and the regular ending are some concept art during the credits and one singular line on a black screen.
Welcome back. What's this? Traveling alone today?
Unsent Signal and the game's true ending are all kind of representative of the approach Capcom took to Pragmata. The only reason to play Unsent Signal was to get some extra gameplay, from more difficult variations of each boss to additional simulations with unique platforming and combat challenges. Whatever bits of narrative exist are merely context to explain why the content is there, but none of it is executed in a way that capitalizes on the setting or its characters. It's not enough to ruin the game for me, and the overall story is so milquetoast I'm more ambivalent towards it than anything else. Nonetheless, I can't help but feel an immense disappointment at how uninteresting it is when, visually and through the first initial trailer, it looks and feels like it should be more. Just because Pragmata is a mechanics-driven experience doesn't mean the narrative had to suffer this badly.
And then we can all go to Earth together.
Yeah.
Honestly, discussing the story is what caused this video to become so delayed. The gameplay? That was easy. The mechanics are rich and wonderful and are absolutely the reason to play Pragmata. That story, however, I know a lot of people like it, people are going to disagree with me regarding Hugh and Diana, but I just feel like there's not enough substance there. Does that change my recommendation though? Not at all. If Pragmata is not in my top 3 games of the year by December, then it was a phenomenal year because this has been my favorite new release up to this point. Plus, as I've stated, I'm all for a video game that is mechanics driven. However, that doesn't mean I do not care about story. On the contrary, I care very much about story, which is why that aspect of Pragmata disappoints me so. The question now is, where do you go from here? Any narrative concerns aside, I don't think you could just take this combat system and pump sequels out real quickly, not if you want to maintain a consistently high quality. I imagine there's a lot of ideas the developers had to leave on the cutting room floor that they'd love to revive or iterate on, but I'm not really sure I want to see a persistent release of Pragmata sequels. Only time will tell, however. For now, I'll just chip away at that lunatic difficulty at some point simply because the game is that fun and unique to play. Even if I don't play it for another year or two, I'll inevitably come back to experience the unique concepts the game provides. If you haven't played Pragmata yet, I hope I was able to convince you to give it a try. It's definitely a brand new IP worth checking out, and I can't imagine anyone who loves action-oriented video games would bounce off of this one. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.